Oh, hey, calling Rick.
Calling. Have we ever done this before? Calling Chris
Nah,
Anderson in Belgium someplace?
Spa. I am in Spa, Belgium.
Spa, Belgium, and you need a
Yes,
spa because it does sound like you have a cold.
I do. Yeah, I do. But a spa would be lovely in Spa. And calling Rick
A s-
Byer, you don't look like your normal humble abode.
I'm in beautiful Tampa, Florida, where I went rowing this morning on the Hillsborough River, but I was very disappointed not to see any
I was
alligators.
gonna say there were the Gators.
None, and I'd been promised gators. I'd been threatened with
I
gators.
would have been scared by Gators.
That too. Hey everybody, welcome to History Happy Hour. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening, excuse me, to the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us. And today, our topic is going to be the story of a highly decorated World War II soldier you've likely never heard of, named Phil Larimore. And we want to thank everybody who supports us, Chris, don't we, on
Absolutely.
Patreon,
Why is it
especially.
there's that one little empty spot at the bottom?
There's a gap there, and there's a whole column there on the right that we can fill in. And you can put your name if you want to become a top shelf patron or a patron at any level. Please check that out at patreon.com/history happy hour. And maybe people want to tell us where they're from and who's watching, and of course, most importantly, what you're drinking.
Yeah.
Chris, who's out there?
Well, Doreen has joined us again, so that's great to see Doreen join us, and Lydia, Fred Brown from San Antonio, Frank Cook from Massachusetts. Good to see a homeboy there, Jack Sadler.
And I see
So
Jim Latin in Menlo Park, and Jim Stark, and various other people, Doug
yeah,
McCord. So it's good to have those of you who've come often, those of you who are coming for the first time. Thank you so much, Chris. I think that we have killed enough time here, and we probably should get on with the point of History
the point
Happy
of this
Hour,
whole show. Yeah.
which is, of course, drinking. So, do you have a drum roll, please?
Yes. The bar is open.
The bar is open, and I just adjusted my mic level, Chris, because I have a feeling that mine was too low. Instead of taking yours down, I
But you
probably
have
should
that
have
really
adjusted mine
professional
up.
look. You have that like professional looking mic. I have gear envy. Look at
I
this.
have I we can get you with the History Happy Hour fund.
All
Can get
right.
you a mic, a better mic. We
Well, no,
can
I
do
have
that.
a mic, but it's just like that looks so geary.
We And for those of you listening on the podcast, it just looks like a blob. Listen, everybody, when it comes to World War II in Europe, D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge probably get the most attention. And far less celebrated is the fighting in Italy, the invasion of southern France, the terrible combat in the Colmar Pocket. And these battlefields feature as the backdrop of a new book about a highly decorated World War II officer named Phil Larimore. And the book, because he fought in all those places, and the book is called um, At First Light, a true World War II story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. And here it is, At First Light. And it is written by his son, Walt Larimore. Walt is a retired family physician who's written or co-written something on the order of 40 books, so I kind of hate him already for that prolific ability of his. Walt Larimore, welcome to History Happy Hour. Did you come in the spirit of History Happy Hour with a cocktail?
I did actually, Chris. I was a Queen's Fellow early in my career, and so
Yeah,
I brought my crown glass from
good for you.
My
Well played,
London,
sir.
my London and Nottingham days, and then Dad, the last 50 years of his career, he was a beloved professor at Harvard. Well, it's LSU. We call it Harvard on the Bayou, and so the Sazerac bar at the Roosevelt Hotel in New
Oh,
York.
yep.
His favorite drink was the Sazerac. So, in honor of Dad, in honor of the crown, an old
Well played, sir. Yes, well played, well played. Yes.
Walt, there's a lot to unpack here, but let me start with this. Your father received a Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest award that the U.S. military can offer, a Silver Star, two Bronze Stars Valor and Two Purple Hearts. But what I want to know is, did you know any of this growing up? I mean, what did you know about his wartime experience? When did you realize that maybe it was something out of the ordinary?
Yeah, my three brothers and I grew up knowing that he had fought in the war. He was an amputee, so he had a wooden leg earlier in our life, and then a more prosthetic leg later. We knew from the pictures in his home office. He had pictures of Eisenhower, General Daniel, and Prescott, and McGarr, all signed with fairly incredible things like "To the best soldier I've ever known, the best bravest man I've ever fought with," all of that. So we knew something had happened. And they had the shadow box, had the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze, 3 Purples, and a slew of others. But he would never talk about it, Chris and Rick. He just, in fact, asked Mom once, how come he doesn't talk about it? And she said, he's just left that in the past. And then on their 45th wedding anniversary, my brothers and I were sitting around with him. And I guess part of it was the timing. Part of it was that the classified secret missions he had been on were now declassified. Part of it was nostalgia. He just began to open up at their anniversary and began to talk. One of my brothers said, Dad, how did you really lose your leg? And he had all sorts of jokes about how he lost it. And he just opened up, began to tell stories that, quite frankly, we did not believe. They were unbelievable. But he kept telling them over and over to friends, and he was a Boy Scout leader, to the kids, the scouts and colleagues. And then when he passed in 2003, he had left in the attic a foot locker, and in it were about 450 letters that he had written home, 3 history books that recounted a number of the stories that had, and then all sorts of newspaper articles published literally around the country that told us he wasn't really fibbing. he was telling the truth, and that began a 16-year journey of beginning to trying to document each of those stories.
I was going to say, if you could write that book in 16 weeks, we're ending the interview.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about, so we have kind of a baseline for people to learn the story from. Tell us a little bit about your dad's background, and he has kind of a unique story about how he even becomes a commissioned officer, right? I mean, even that is different.
Yeah, he was basically a juvenile delinquent. He grew up in Memphis. His dad, a Pullman conductor, so he was traveling from Memphis there, Chris, to your hometown in Chicago, or Memphis down to New Orleans. So he's away quite a bit. His mother was the executive secretary of the founder of the largest law firm in Memphis. So she often worked very long days. And so he began to get in trouble as a kid, kind of had a difficult background, wasn't very good in school, didn't enjoy it, but he loved the Boy Scouts. He loved the wilderness. He loved camping. He loved hunting. He became an equestrian at a very young age, and all of that to keep him probably out of juvenile court. And then finally it got to the point that grandmom and granddad, his mom and dad, sent him to Gulf Coast Military Academy. And he spent his high school years there, 4 years there, graduating in 1942. And it was there that he really found his purpose, his passion. He became a excellent student in the ROTC and an honor student. And because of that, when the war began in 1941, at least from the U.S. Viewpoint, he was the youngest ever attendee and graduate of OCS, Officer Candidate School, the Army Officer Candidate School in Fort Benning. Graduated before his 18th birthday, was commissioned on his 18th birthday, and as far as I can tell, was the youngest commissioned Army officer, second lieutenant in the war, certainly the youngest frontline officer. Trained for a year and then went overseas, joined the 3rd Infantry Division, coming in at Anzio, and then fought all the way until 1 month before the end of the war. 15 months of gruesome, horrific, day-by-day frontline battle.
Something like 413 days, some number.
Well, the 3rd Division I know has more time in combat than any other division in the Army during World War II. So that's...
Yeah, we pulled up this map. Now, he joins them at Anzio, which, of course, is there on the Italian boot. But by the time he gets there, they've already been through North Africa and Sicily And I think you describe them as having like 7 D-days, essentially, don't you, Walt?
They did. He used to always. I mean, he had such great admiration of what he called the Northern boys. The Northern France into Germany boys that began their war in Normandy. But at times he would kiddingly call them the sissies. He would say, "Well, those guys fought for 336 days. We fought for 913. He fought for 413 of those." Whenever I've interviewed anybody for this book, I say, as you guys know, what do you think of when you think of D-Day? And everyone, to a person, says Normandy. But the Southern guys had 5 divisional D-Days. I mean, they came on board in, French Morocco, and then they had Sicily, and then they had Salerno, then they had Anzio, and then they had Southern France. They had 5. And then his battalion, 3rd Battalion of the 30th Infantry, had 2 the division, the 3rd Division actually had 2 more D-Days on Sicily. So the 3rd Division, the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Division actually had 7 D-Days during the war. Chris, as we talked about before, they were one of the first 5 divisions into the war. Of the 89 divisions that fought in World War II, they had the most casualties. The division ran roughly 15,000 at a time. They had almost 37,000 casualties in their days of fighting. And I call them the Forgotten Division, fighting on the forgotten front of Southern Europe. And yet we could not have won the war without them.
Yeah.
I've already lost track. Whose turn is it, Chris?
Oh, well, I'll go again. I mean, one of the things that I was wondering, given that you as a writer, when somebody shows up with 400 plus letters as primary source documents, that's sort of a windfall. What is your dad saying as the war approaches, or as he's getting ready to experience this? Is he aware of the enormity of the world, or what he's about to face, or is he just an 18-year-old kid saying, "Hey, I'm going to go join the army"?
Yeah, great question, Chris. Well, he had 4 years of military prep.
Yeah.
He had learned, he'd become a glider pilot, he'd become a Cessna pilot, he had become an equestrian, he'd become an infantry and weapons expert. He became one of the 4 leaders at the school. He became a sailing expert. He became an expert in cross country travel by compass, navigation, armor, infantry. I mean, it's amazing the training that these kids had. And so he graduated just after Pearl Harbor. And so he was taken in quickly, and as were almost everybody in his class at Gulf Coast Military Academy. And initially sent off to Fort Wheeler, and then very quickly after that to officer candidate school. As you guys know, most of the attendees of OCS are college graduates. And here's a guy who's just a high school graduate. But because of the needs and because of his background, because of his graduation with honor, they took him. And he actually became an honor graduate at OCS and a leader there. He was by far the youngest of his cadre in training there. And some of the stories that I was able to obtain from guys that he went there with, and then, of course, his stories of OCS became a foundation of the book that then moved forward. I was able to interview dozens and dozens of men that he fought with, of their families, of other men that he fought with. And then, of course, finding source documents. I spent the 16 years in 8 different states, over 24 military facilities and archives and museums, and then time in Italy, France, and England, putting together what turned out to be a 1 million word source document. And then it was just a matter of, well, where's the real fruit in this that remind our country of the shoulders we sit on. I was really skeptical when Tom Brokaw came out with the book The Greatest Generation. I went, yeah. There's a lot of great generations in our country, and this is just hyperbole, and Tom's trying to sell some books. Well, I'm in his camp now. These guys were unique, and what they did was astounding. The suffering, the sacrifice, and in the case of the Southern Front, the unrecognized success that allowed liberty and freedom to continue.
So, your dad, Phil Larimore, lands at Anzio. He's joining the 3rd Division, which is already there, which is suddenly having a shortage of second lieutenants and first lieutenants because they are rapidly being killed by the Germans. And I just, we don't always focus on the replacement system, and when we do, it tends to be sort of a negative thing. But here he is. He's brought, by stages to the battlefield where he's going to be shoved in a new division, the 3rd Division, where he knows almost nobody. It turns out there's one person he does know. He's, I think, 20 or 21 years old. He's going to be commanding a platoon that is filled with veterans, and many of whom are older than him. So this is obviously a really difficult situation. Paint us a little picture of what's going on in Anzio. He's leading an ammo platoon, what they're doing, and of course he eventually at Anzio, it takes place the action in which he is for which he is awarded a Silver Star.
Yeah, he was a 19-year-old actually when he hit the beach as a replacement about 28 days into what those guys called the bitch head. Anzio beachhead was about roughly 10, 15 miles square, roughly 15 miles deep, 10 miles wide, and was surrounded by a mountain range into which the Germans had been dug in for a number of years. The plain was literally flat. It had been swamp that had been reclaimed by Mussolini. He had dug canals and put in pump stations. And so they walked into this quagmire of being totally surrounded. And it was the closest thing, I think, in World War II to the trench warfare of World War I. They literally had to dig in. There was not a square inch of Anzio that could not be bombed, and that wasn't bombed. In fact, it's even interesting reading the records of the hospital, the hospital tents, the wards, the operating rooms, large tents with huge red crosses on top, repeatedly bombed. And I remember reading one of the nurses, one of her letters home, talking about that when operations were occurring, when the bombing began, the corpsmen would actually come around, put helmets on the surgeons, on the nurse's head, and then a helmet over the patient's head. And they didn't stop. They did not stop operating during the bombing. But eventually the hospital dug in, and it was literally trench warfare. Dad was a leader of a A&P platoon, ammunition and pioneer platoon. He was part of the 30th Infantry Regiment. And those guys literally worked in no man's land all night, every night. So from sun went down until at first light, they were busy setting mines, defusing mines, setting concertina wire, cutting wire, hauling bodies back, bringing ammunition to the front, engineering material if it was needed. In fact, they would often work nights and hear Germans talking 10 to 15 yards away from them. So you can imagine whenever the phosphorus bombs went off, they literally hugged the earth because they were so close to the enemy. And he wasn't, I don't think, any different than a lot of young men who went to battle for glory and sort of the John Wayne, let's go kick the Heil out of Hitler type guys. But the first night he was there, one of the privates he was working with messed up defusing a bomb and blew his face off. And the next day they were leaving the field at night. He was walking with one of his men and an 88 gun, an anti-aircraft gun that could shoot horizontally and was a devastating weapon. A projectile shot through one of the men that was walking next to him and literally cut his man in half. And then the next day, one of the most discouraging of many days of discouragement for him, one of his newest men was on the front. They were getting ready to leave, and two Germans stood up to wave white flags, yelling, "Comrade, comrade," which was their way of saying, we're surrendering. And Dad, even though only 3 days in, knew the evil, the despicableness that they were fighting against, and he knew of the fake surrenders. And one of his guys stood up to take these two prisoners of war, and Dad screamed, "Get down, get down." And two German snipers shot that man's head off. And war was no longer a glory. It was no longer legacy. It now was a grinding, horrific, terrific, day by day for 413 days battle on the front line. And as you said, Chris, it was almost 3 weeks in that he and what would become his best friend in life, Ross Calvert. Ross was one of his instructors at OCS, and instructors and the candidates, the cadets, are not supposed to be friends, but they became dear friends. And then they found each other at Anzio, serving in the 30th Infantry Division, and served together throughout the war. But anyway, he and Ross were sent in one night to take over a house on the plain of Anzio, were hundreds of stone houses that the commune lived in, that the farmers came in. And so they were sent in to capture a house that had been taken from the Germans, and the Germans wanted that back fairly badly. When dawn at first light came, the commander of their battalion came up to the house and was very concerned that there weren't enough mines to keep the Germans back. And so he sent the A&P platoon out at dawn in light, within 50 yards of the enemy, within full view of the enemy, to plant mines. Dad could not send his men to do that. And so he went out and did it himself. And the story is that the ground around him was shredded by mortars and by machine gun fire and automatic small gun fire. He set the mines and then very quickly crawled back, just literally shaking in his boots. It resulted in the Silver Star, but the first of his medals of valor. But it also resulted in a changed man. He now understood war. He now understood life and death. He now understood the value of each breath he took. And he understood the sacrifice his men would have to make. And he never would let them or tell them to do something he wouldn't do himself.
So, well, I mean, it's a fairly amazing thing to picture these young men, being thrown into this sort of thing. Your dad is a very young man. He's thrown into not just the military, not just into combat, but probably one of the most difficult operations of the war. Not only that, but he's actually responsible for other men's lives. Did you see anything in his letters where he's talking about how he's adjusting to this, or how he's able to maintain his morale, or what he thinks of this situation? I mean, this is not the Anzio. These landings were not the American Army at its finest, tactically.
No, it was very difficult. In fact, Anzio may be one of the first recorded instances in modern war history of biologic warfare, because before Anzio began, before the attack on Anzio, Mussolini and Hitler had ordered that all the dams and all the pumps be destroyed, knowing that as the area, the marshes reflooded, that once winter began to break, the mosquitoes would break out and malaria would break out. In fact, Dad's first hospitalization was for malaria, temperature of 104 degrees, and taking a medication called Atibrine that actually made you turn yellow. They ended up using it as a prophylactic medicine also. But in his letters, and I found this to be typical of most of the men's letters that I found in my research, they did not want to worry. They did not want to upset their mothers and their fathers, their brothers and their sisters, or their girlfriends, or if they were married, their spouses. The closest he came to really speaking about what was going on was in his letters to friends, and there's several scattered throughout the book. But the true horror, he didn't really. We didn't become aware of until he began to talk 9 years before his death.
Yeah.
So he's fighting at Anzio. He is awarded the Silver Star for his actions there, and then he is part of an operation which is called Operation Dragoon, and the 3rd Division is invading France, but not where everybody thinks of France as being invaded, not just the 3rd Division, of course, but they're actually going to be attacking Provence from the Mediterranean and working their way up. And this is a secondary invasion front that commanded by General Patch that happens in August of 1944. And this is another one of those fronts, those campaigns, Walt, that I think, unless people are really into this, that many people don't even know about.
It was a massive, a humongous D-Day. And of course, we're rapidly jumping over the breakout of Anzio, which was perhaps the worst battle for the 3rd Division. In fact, they suffered almost 1,000 men that were killed or wounded. It was the most casualties of a single division in World War II, just breaking out of Anzio and then racing to Rome to liberate Rome. And they liberated Rome, but their mistake was they liberated Rome on June 4th and June 5th. And there was something that happened on June 6th that took away all of the headlines. So it was fun going back to newspaper archives and finding the original headlines of the liberation of Rome that was going to be published around the country in every newspaper in June 6th, 1944. And then all of those typesets were thrown away. And then, of course, Normandy had begun. And so, in fact, Eric Severide, the CBS reporter and correspondent who was embedded in the 3rd Infantry, in his biography, he talks about actually typing his story about the liberation of Rome. And in those days, the reporters only had 1 hour a day of teletype access. The cables underneath the Atlantic were carrying military communication 23 hours a day. It was freed up 1 hour a day for the journalists. And so all of the guys, this is all men, were in one of the hotels, I think it was the Savoy or Excelsior Hotel in Rome, typing up their stories. And a BBC reporter came in, and this is about 2 a.m., and said, "Boys, throw your stories away. The invasion from England has begun." And so that began them being the forgotten front, if you would. Patch and Devers and Truscott, their generals were not publicity hounds. They weren't Pattons or Bradleys, who all loved publicity. They simply weren't those type of leaders. And so the preparation for the D-Day in southern France didn't have the PR that Normandy had. And also it had a big negative. Winston Churchill did not want to have the Southern Front, the Southern D-Day. He vehemently opposed it. He was overruled, and obviously it had it. And that pincher move of the Northern Front from Normandy, the Southern Front, starting in the Côte d'Azur, if you would, was really the pincher move that helped cut off and seal that entire Western Front. But to his credit, Dad wrote home about they were on the boats, they were heading towards D-Day, and he and Ross Calvert saw a boat coming up behind them, and they looked, and Ross said, "Phil, that's Winston Churchill." And sure enough, it was. He came in. It was a secret mission. He came as Colonel Kent to come on vacation from England, but it was really Winston Churchill saying, by his actions, even though I disagreed with this, I am going to support the Allies who are putting their lives on the line with this next D-Day that happened on, as you said, August 15th, 1944.
And Walt, did your dad, obviously he had a lot on his plate right then, but did he comment on the Normandy landings or the fact that, we did liberate Rome? Does anybody know this? Or was there any mention of this in his letters?
Yeah, it was a chip on the block.
Yeah.
He would say, when people think of the first capital liberated in Europe, they think of Paris. Well, that was August of 1944. We liberated Rome in June of 44.
Right.
People think of the Battle of the Bulge. We had 2 Battle of the Bulges. They think of the Hürtgen Forest. Our battle of the Vosges Forest was far worse, far more deadly, far more costly, and far colder. In fact, the winter of 44-45 in the Vosges Mountains and then on the Colmar Plain was the coldest recorded in Europe in over 45, 50 years. And some people say that it was the coldest ever in Europe. In fact, do you guys know the name Stephen Ambrose?
I that's vaguely rings a bell. I'm not sure.
Well, Ambrose was at one time, of course, I went to the University of New Orleans and spent almost 2 weeks listening to all of the recordings that he and Hugh, his brother, made of the soldiers in World War II. And in one of those, there's a quote that it was either in Citizen Soldiers or Band of Brothers, I don't remember which, but he said that the winter was so dreadful that it could only be experienced. It could not be described. It was indescribable. Yeah. And he recounts that there were a number of men, I think fact, I think he said every man that he interviewed that fought in the Vosges Mountains or the Colmar Plains, when they talked about it, visibly shivered. It was not only horribly cold, it was cloudy. There was no air support at all because of the clouds. That made artillery support extremely difficult. The German army, was dug in to the Vosges Mountains and it had years to dig in. In fact, you guys love history. History tells us that no army ever defeated an army in the Vosges Mountains, not one time in history, and never in winter until the Allies, particularly the U.S. Army, took the Vosges. And so what he wrote about was a little bit of a chip that they were forgotten. And, he wasn't alone.
No.
When Truscott went on the first Memorial Day after World War II, General Truscott went to the cemetery at Anzio. And when he went up to give his talk, there's no recording, there's no film of this. The World War II cartoonist, Bill Malden, was there and happened to record this, so we wouldn't know that it happened. But General Truscott walked up to the crowd, turned his back to them, and addressed the men who were in the grave, the men that he and that my dad called the heroes of World War II. And he said, he actually apologized to the men that were the heroes that were, that were in the ground, who for any errors in judgment that he might have made. But he also said that there were feats that they accomplished that no army in the war had accomplished or in history, to his knowledge, had accomplished. And his sadness was that they were not remembered, that they were forgotten. In fact, a real quick bunny trail, one of the sweetest things that happened when I was writing this book, a 3rd Infantry reenactor told me a story. They were up in Washington and one of, the hero, when they bring in the hero flights. And so they were reenacting some of the 3rd Infantry stuff. And there were some 30th Infantry guys there. And so when they talked about the 30th Infantry, the 3rd Division, the Forgotten Front, a number of the men began to cry. And so this reenactor kneeled down by one of the men and he said, "Are you okay?" And the guy smiled and he said, "Yeah." He said, "I am." He said, "I thought me and the guys had been forgotten. And now I know we've been remembered. And I am so happy that we have not been forgotten." In fact, the original title of the book was Forgotten, just because the Southern Front has been forgotten. So great question, Chris. But he didn't so much talk about the Northern Front as what they did and the pride they had for how they did what they did.
I want to remind everybody that we are speaking today to Walt Larimore, who is the author of At First Light, the true World War story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. We'll get to the horse, I promise. The horse will be gotten to. But, well, I can't help but ask you, why did you change the title? Who do we blame for that, or who do we praise for that, or what's the story? I've been through this, and I'm sure Chris has too. Chris is and was an editor, so
how long ago in a galaxy far, far away.
He's changing things. But what happened there? What happened on the title? Give us the inside scoop.
Well, it really started as an attempt to one up the trilogy series of Rick Atkinson. Yeah, guy wins the Pulitzer Prize for writing about the Southern Front. But I wanted to bring it down from the big picture to a small picture, to the frontline officer, men who had a life expectancy on Anzio of 39 days. Throughout the war, had a life expectancy. The second lieutenants averaged a life expectancy throughout the various campaigns in the Southern Front of 59 to 60 days. It was just, so I wanted to bring it down to their level. And so reduced about 6,000 citations through 750 primary sources, reduced it down to what I thought was a fairly decent history book. But I'm not a historian. I'm not an editor. I'm not a journalist. I'm just a storyteller. And so I think it was 49 publishers said, "Well, thanks, but no thanks, not interested." A couple of them, one at St. Martin's Press and one at Penguin, said, why don't you tell? They said you've hidden your dad's story, and we understand why. You're not interested in writing a nepotistic book or a legacy book. You're lifting up the guys on the Southern Front, but you've hidden your dad's story. Go back and tell your dad's story. And so another author that I'd worked with, Mike Yorkie, Mike cut his teeth in writing. He was a tennis player, and so he wrote all the biographies for the tennis players. But Mike and I had done a book together in the past, and so my agent actually suggested that I talk with Mike about the possibility of combining forces and changing this from a history book to a narrative nonfiction book or a creative nonfiction book. In other words, still nonfiction, still true to the source documents, but to bring in some of the dialogue and some of the story in a way that would almost make it like a novel. In fact, my reaction to that was to actually change it to a novel. And I'm in a writer's group, and a dear friend, Jerry Jenkins, I guess Jerry's written 200 books, sold 172 million books. But Jerry said, Walt, fiction has to be believable. Nonfiction has to be unbelievable. And this book is literally unbelievable. You need to make it nonfiction. So Mike and I combined forces, made it a creative nonfiction book to read like a novel. And when it was reshopped by the agent, we had 3 offers in 3 days. And so part of the 16 years was research. Part of it was just waiting for the right time, the right presentation, and the right publisher to be able to tell the story.
Damn editors. See?
Well, I tell you what, Chris, I'm a little worried because the book had some editing difficulties at the end. It has about 75 errors that need to be corrected in the next printing. And so the editor and you, I imagine, will see some of those edit mistakes. But overall, most of the reviewers haven't seen those, so that's good news.
Oh yeah, we're often misunderstood, but So look, we've been talking about the Forgotten Front. I mean, I know a little bit about it. You obviously know an immense amount about it. But as I guess kind of my next, I know it's kind of a softball question, but from the landings in southern France, why don't you give us a sales pitch about what's going on there? Why is it important? What have we overlooked about this whole front of the war in France? What's your dad involved in?
Yeah. I think Eisenhower has made it clear. I've had the opportunity to read all of his books, but he was convinced, despite Churchill and some of the others in leadership concern, he was concerned that the Northern Front, the Battle of the Bulges would become more realistic, depending upon the resources that Hitler took from the Eastern Front and put into the Western Front. They knew the damage they were doing to the industrial complex, but didn't know how effective that was. And so the worry was, is there going to be more difficulty in the Northern Front? Do we do the pincher move from the south so we totally seal the Western Front, that we basically eliminate the Italian army, eliminate the German 19th Army, which they effectively did by the time they reached Alsace or northeast France. In fact, the Forgotten guys actually crossed the Rhine River 3 times, and the Northern guys only crossed it once. But that pincher move ended up being successful. And Patton and Bradley and Montgomery, all in their writings later, write about the ultimate right of that decision. It's just it's never been publicized, what they did or how they did it.
So I'm going to steal a question from you, Rick.
Please.
So, well, if you could then, again, bring it down to the level of your dad, any man that's been in that much time on the line has got lots of stories, and I hope people buy the book and they read about the stories. But why don't you tell us about one engagement in particular that kind of stuck out to you, stuck out to your dad, and use that to illustrate the nature of the fighting that he's experiencing in France?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I appreciate it. I think the one that stands out the most to me occurred in the Vosges Mountains. These were very rugged mountains. They had very few roads. The roads that they did not handle military traffic. Because of the clouds, there was no air support. There was no artillery. Guys were literally fighting step by step, foot by foot through dense forests, through either freezing rain or ice or snow, with difficulty being reinforced because they had moved so fast from Toulouse and Marseille in southern France. They had moved so quickly, sometimes 100 miles a day, that the supply lines were stretched thin. Because they moved so quickly, because they got in the mountains in winter, they didn't even have winter clothing. They were guys that were digging foxholes were having to use newspaper and taking coats off of dead German soldiers just to be able to stay warm. And the Germans had a cruel form of devastation. They would take these, I mentioned the 88 anti-aircraft guns, but they had a variety of other artillery that they had projectiles that they could shoot into the trees, into the ceiling of the trees. And the projectiles would break apart into thousands of bullets, if you would, of white hot steel, and it would literally cut through flesh. You weren't even safe in a foxhole. The guys had to cover their foxholes with branches that were 3 or 4 inches thick just to survive. Not only could you be attacked from the front, you could be attacked from the rear because of the Germans were dug in. So a patrol or a platoon could move forward, and before they knew it, be literally surrounded on all sides. So it was terribly, terribly difficult. Dad and one of his men, one of the things that Dad had invented in Anzio was bringing ammunition to the front line with mules. Yeah. That wasn't unique to him. It had actually been done on mainland in Italy, but he was the one that brought it into Italy, and then he brought it into the Vosges Mountains. General Truscott met with him and said, can we do the mules here because of the difficulty transporting our ammunition and supplies and food and that sort of thing. So he did. So he and a man and a mule brought in ammunition one night to a group of Rangers who were occupying a high ridge above St. D is the name of the city. And the Germans had brought in an elite infantry from Norway of crackerjack infantry. And because of this outpost that was so dangerous to them, they sent in this 2nd Mountain Division to not only surround, but to completely annihilate this small group of Rangers. And so for 48 hours, Dad and his friend brought in ammunition, but then they were immediately surrounded. And so they fought with the frontline guys for 48 hours. They literally fought almost to the last man and almost to the last bullet. In fact, he and his sergeant named Happy, who was one of the old men, Happy had actually come into the original French Morocco D-Day, but he and Happy were down to their final bullets and literally to the bayonets when the rescue came in, if you would. But the writing of that battle, what happened in that battle, the way I think I was able to translate it for people by interviewing either men who had been there or their children or reading their memoirs, actually in the Army Heritage Education Center up in Pennsylvania. They collected the memoirs of soldiers from World War II, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them, and most of them are handwritten. And to read the memoirs of the guys that were there that fought, Chris, it was a devastating, difficult, horrible battle. It ended up in a severe wound for Dad, got shot through the leg, had to be evacuated to the back, to the rear, where he recovered for about 6 weeks. And the interesting thing was he recovered next to another young officer. They traded stories about their medals. At that point, their medal count was about the same. They both were next to the nurse's station. They both fell in love with the same nurse. This guy actually won her, and his name was Audie Murphy. And so Dad became friends with Audie Murphy. They recovered in the hospital together. Audie did not marry that particular nurse. And then they met again on the Colmar Plain. They were both part of the Battle of La Maison Rouge on the Colmar Plain.
Wow. Did your dad express any opinion? Someone wants to know about Audie Murphy's book and movie, To Hell and Back.
Yeah, he thought that they were very real. He liked them. I don't have any evidence that he and Audie kept in touch, but I think that's true of a lot of people that Audie fought with and knew. Even Pricey, the nurse that he asked to marry him, who turned her down, both she and the commander of the hospital, who was the head surgeon that took care of the men every day, at least in the officers' ward, both wrote in their memoirs about after Audie Murphy's Life magazine article, how they had never contacted him either. And so that may have just been part of many of our viewers and listeners will know that Audie suffered from terrible PTSD, had great difficulty with anxiety and depression, and so that may have been part of what was going on with him.
Chris, can I keep going?
No, please. I jumped you. You jumped me.
Yeah. So we have to talk about the horse.
The horse. I was going to say.
So you don't have to give away everything, okay? And I'm sure that you know how you want to talk about it. But this is the horse and the amazing horse. Give us a little bit of this story, as much as you feel like that. That kind of brings us into that.
Oh, wait. Like, before you do, before we get to the horse, I think the important link here is he loses a leg. So
he does. Actually,
maybe lose a leg and then get a horse. Do we have time?
But
for
he
that?
meets the horse before he loses the leg.
Well, okay.
It's a little bit hard to know what order to do it in.
Jeez.
And now we're starting to give it away. But
details.
We'll shut up now, Walt. You shut. We'll shut
take
up.
over, Walt. You got it. You got this.
Well, actually, it was April 3rd, 1945. They had crossed the Siegfried Line. They were advancing through Germany. Thank Hitler for the Autobahn, which they were able to use to race through Germany and finally end the war. But Dad was a master equestrian. The book is full of stories of his horse stories, his war horse stories. In fact, one of the titles of the book was going to be War Horses because of the horse stories, and then the men themselves that were war horses. But the commander of the 30th Infantry Regiment, McCarr, was an equestrian. The commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, John O'Daniel, was an equestrian. Of course, Patton was an equestrian. And there were rumors that Hitler had brought all of the world's population of Lipizan stallions, the dancing white stallions of Vienna, Austria, into Czechoslovakia to make the perfect horse. The truth is that he actually brought all of 5 or 6 breeds. He brought the Lipizans, Frisians, Andalusians, Berbers, thoroughbreds, all into these horse farms in Czechoslovakia. The Lipizans were in one. And they were going to make this master breed horse for the master breed Aryans. Because of the Yalta Agreement, Czechoslovakia was going to be liberated by Russia. And Russia was coming in from the Eastern Front. And the rumors were that they were killing and eating everything because of the starvation that they had experienced during the war. And then a convoy, it's not clear from the records, but somewhere between 20 and 22 Lipizans were on a trailer being brought away from the Russians. They were caught, they were stopped, and all but one of the Lipizans were killed, skinned, cooked, and eaten. So the Nazi vets went crazy thinking, we've got all of the world's population of several breeds. They literally could be beef stew, or I guess horse stew, equine stew, if you would. And so they wanted to send in somebody to see, was this true or was it not? Dad was chosen. He was asked to volunteer. He was told he would fly in with a pilot. He could not know the name of the pilot or vice versa. He was told there would be no record of this. He was told that if he was captured, he would be considered AWOL. If he was killed, he would be AWOL, and his family would have no access to life insurance. He would be disavowed. And he didn't even think about it. He accepted. And so they flew in on April 3rd, I think it was April 3rd, 1944, April 2nd, April 3rd. It was difficult weather. The plane, which was a Cessna, it was a Piper Cub, had literally about a 180 to 200 mile that it could fly, and it was literally that far in. But they made it in. They were able to glide into the forest. The Czechoslovakian resistance met them. And one of the Nazi vets, Captain Lessing, came out to meet Dad on a Lipizan. He did not know Dad was an equestrian, so he had brought a thoroughbred with him. And Lessing and Dad rode around the farm. He was able to identify the breeds, confirm that they were there, and also find what the U.S. Army didn't know, that there were POWs there. British and American POWs made up the majority of the POWs. So they went back to the plane. There's a fun part of the story because Lessing challenged Dad to a steeplechase course, and Dad and his thoroughbred won. Well, that thoroughbred is Chug. And after the war, Patton, who considered those horses they did go in, they did get them. It was called Operation Cowboy. It became a Disney movie, The Miracle of the White Stallions. They were able to walk the Lipizans out and save them, but Patton brought back some of those horses as war spoil, including, I think, 3 Lipizans for himself. But he also brought back that horse for Dad. Dad, as far as I know, never met Patton, but his chief of staff was a Colonel Fountain, and Colonel Fountain had a daughter named Marilyn, who Dad was engaged to, and that's another whole part of the book. So I think probably Colonel Fountain was the connection to Patton that got that horse, amazing horse, that Dad says saved his life because of the way the Army treated him. 5 days after his secret mission, he was in a battle. His men were surrounded by 150 Germans, a small squad. He went in on a tank to save his men, which he did. That action resulted in the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross. Almost cost him his life, and it did cost him his leg.
And this is the Western Union telegram from that. His parents are informed he was seriously wounded. And so if you're getting the impression that there's a lot of stuff going on in this book, there is. And it's kind of, it's interesting to follow it all and to follow sort of this fighting through a little bit through Phil Larimore. And one of the things, Phil, that you talk about also, I mean, so it's kind of interesting to me. There's a lot of things in the book that where you're shining a little bit of a light on things that we don't usually talk about. So I mentioned the replacement system, the Southern Theater is another one. Another one is, people recovering from traumatic injuries. Okay, so usually in the war story, it's like, well, so and so loses a leg or loses an arm, and then later they become a real estate agent in Des Moines, and you don't kind of get the whole story of kind of what they're going through emotionally and physically, and that's what you kind of talk about that story, but also talk about, as your dad is fighting that battle, he's also fighting a battle to try to stay in the Army. He wants to stay in the Army, and the Army is not, completely receptive to that.
No, coming back as an amputee, the good thing the Army did was to develop 11 hospitals that just took care of amputee soldiers. About 2% of all men wounded in battle who survived were amputees. So he was sent to one of those hospitals in Atlanta. Typically, when the guys came back, they had the uniforms, they had the medals. Gals flocked to them like flies, but not amputees. They didn't have that experience. Even some of the healthcare professionals that took care of them saw them, particularly the Army physicians, saw them as less than human, less than fully people. It really played with him. He had a great deal of depression, a great deal of self-doubt about what the future was going to be. And his salvation was a chaplain at the hospital. And I became aware of not only we've not talked about, but the amazing medics who saved so many lives and suffered so many casualties, but the amazing chaplains who took care of men who had been wounded seriously spiritually and saved so many lives. And so Dad wrote to his best friend, Bill, about he was visiting with one of the chaplains and just so despondent about losing a leg and not being complete and girls not dating him or going out with him. And if I could, I just read a little excerpt from that letter. He was talking to the chaplain, and this is what he wrote that the chaplain said. The chaplain kind of pulled up a chair and got right into his face, eye to eye, and very gruffly said, "Son, your wound will either make you a bitter person or a better person." His life was shattered. Here he was, a fairly bitter person. The chaplain went on and said, "It'll either harden your heart or it'll soften it. You'll either be a person changed for the worse or one who chooses to make the world better. In my opinion," this guy said, "in my opinion, the worst disability in life isn't being disabled. It's being disabled with a bad attitude." Okay, the Germans smashed your leg, but don't let them smash your heart, your talents, your gifts, your will, your faith in God and his plan for your life. But son, the choice is up to you. And that turned Dad around. In fact, it turned him around to the point that he decided, what the Army had a policy: if you were enlisted and lost extremity, an arm or leg, you could stay in if you had a job in the Army. If you're an officer, you weren't considered fully human. You were not an officer and a gentleman, so you were discharged, irrespective of staying in. And Dad said that is inhumane, that's unfair, that's irrational. And so General John Daniel, who had headed the 3rd Infantry Division, was back at OCS in Fort Benning. So he offered Dad a job. McCarr was head of the military unit in Washington, and he offered him a job. So Dad went to Washington to serve with then Colonel McCarr, later General McCarr, and also Ross Calvert, his best friend, and fought the military. He appealed the decision to have him discharged. He became friends with President Truman. He became friends with General Eisenhower. In fact, General Eisenhower had actually seen him off in Europe after he was discharged and flown. I mean, after he was being flown home. But anyway, they fought this horrible, horrible policy. And one of the greatest finds that I had in my research was in the National Archives. In fact, Colonel Fred Brown is on this broadcast today, and Fred and I went to several military installations together to research it. But Fred was there when I found the transcript of his appeal. It occurred at Walter Reed General Hospital. He had lost every appeal up to that point. This was the Army Retiring Board, and there were 5 colonels there. A couple of them sort of washed up colonels. One had been defrocked as a general, and anyway, they weren't real happy about their assignment, I don't think. But I actually found the transcript of that. And Chris and Rick, it reminds me of the movie A Few Good Men, where Tom Cruise was playing the attorney that was questioning the Marine general, that was played by Jack Nicholson. You remember that scene, that courtroom scene? This was very similar to that. And when I found the transcript, I just couldn't believe it. Dad was, I'll just read a little bit of this, but he was allowed to testify at the hearing. And he said, "I have a position offered to me if the War Department policy allows me to go on general service with a waiver for my leg. I feel I'm perfectly capable of holding down almost any job the Army can offer me." And Colonel Killian very calmly and politely said, "Bullshit." This is in the record. "Bullshit. You're a cripple. Mind you, a highly decorated cripple, but a cripple." And that's what he faced. Another of the men talking about his awards and his medals said, "That's all pretty dressing, Captain, but the Army is already preparing for its next war. We don't need any one-legged handicaps." Just brutal. And he wasn't alone. He wasn't alone of the hundreds of thousands of men who were wounded, of the tens of thousands that were amputees. And yet, most recovered. Most went on to very productive lives. They loved this country. They loved their families. Most of them worked in one job for life, had one spouse for life. Most of them raised us kids well. Most of them breathed differently because they understood the value of life. They understood freedom, and they understood liberty. And I hope a book like this will help remind us of the country that we have, that we keep it, we love it, we not destroy it.
Walt Larimore, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book, At First Light, a true World War II story of a hero, his bravery, and an amazing horse. And you got to meet the horse, and there's many other horses and mules. And it's a fascinating story. And
you'll be happy to know that we only covered a very small part.
I mean, we talked about all
book.
these different things, and we've barely scratched the surface. So please check it out. And Walt, thank you. Good luck with it. And too bad about those other 49 publishers who said no. And we appreciate your coming on today to talk about it.
Well, it's great to be with you. And Chris and Rick, I look forward to the day maybe Stephen Ambrose tours. We'll do a little Southern Front tour. We'll do Anzio and Rome and up through
let's do a 3rd Division tour.
Well, you and I should talk, because funny you mentioned that. Stay tuned.
Okay, and to all of our listeners and viewers, thanks for today. And
that was just between you guys. Nobody else heard that.
Nobody heard that.
Okay, yeah. That's just shh, be quiet. Okay. Thanks,
Thank
Walt.
you, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks so much.
Hey, so Chris, next week we are going to be talking about. We're going to try to change gears a little bit.
Yes, we are.
From
there'll be horses though.
There will be horses, and there is a
Yeah.
delinquent also, but he does not. He does not
Doesn't
win
turn out
any.
quite the same way.
He does not win any awards. We're going to be talking to James Mills, who's a young Australian who has written a rather hefty book on Billy the Kid that has caught the attention of other historians. One of whom said that we should talk to him, and we did, and we are, and it's a fabulous. Fabulous story. So, Billy the Kid next week on History Happy Hour. And then after that, we're going to have a couple of weeks of encore episodes before we start new shows again in January. So, that's the story. And a reminder to everybody that you can find archived programs and more at our website, historyhappyhour.com. You can listen to episodes on the History Happy Hour podcast.
And you can join as a Patreon member and get a hat.
You have to be a top shelf member.
Oh, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah. You can get a hat if you become a Patreon top shelf member. And just a reminder, that's that.
That's that list.
And anyway, guys, thank you so much. Keep living, keep learning.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.